Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good day, depending on where you are today. As you know, today's sessions will be global. We're going to start the day in Europe, transition here to LA, and later this evening, we're going to get into a conversation in Japan. So, hope you're all strapped in. We had a wonderful day yesterday to kick off our entertainment conversation. We talked a little bit about where the industry is headed, about monetization, brand partnerships, consumer trends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Had great conversations with Bon and Bao, Brett Schneider, who brought us folks from the LA Sparks and Complex and so on. It was just a wonderful way to start our week. We're going to be going today, tomorrow, and Friday. And so I just wanted to quickly review and recap what you can expect to see. Coming up next will be a conversation that we titled Wide World of Sports. One of our alums, David Dellea, who handles the sports practice over at PwC, has been collaborating with us to pull together a conversation where you get to see what's happening really with international sport. So we'll have one of the executives from FIBA, the International Basketball Association, the CEO of the European Club Association. So that's the organization that works with the soccer clubs and football clubs, as they would say over there, and an executive who handles women's soccer for FIFA. So hopefully that'll be a great conversation where you'll get a better sense of what's going on internationally. Obviously, there are a bunch of major events coming up, but we can also talk about the differences and comparisons in terms of how the business works and the differences in terms of how COVID impacted the sports world overseas. I want to remind you that as we go through this experience, there are two things that you have at your disposal that I want to make sure you take advantage of. The first is the expo. I believe the expo will be open at the top of the hour, so in about 55 minutes. You're welcome to go there, meet people, talk to some of our exhibitors about some of the programs we're running here at UCLA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, Hopin has a feature where you can actually have one-on-one conversations with other attendees. And so we are planning to have networking sessions, including one this afternoon, that you can take advantage of just before I go on with Emma Yamazaki in Japan to talk about her film Koshien. The second thing I want to make sure that you guys know is that we really do encourage the back and forth conversation. I noticed some people submitting questions yesterday via various means. Our preferred method is that you use Slido. You will see in the interface in Hopin that you can use Slido to post questions. Those questions will go directly to our team so that they can funnel them along to the moderator. And for questions that are kind of part of the conversation, we'll try to work those into the conversation. So please use Slido. Also, for those of you who don't necessarily have questions of your own, it's a place where you can vote questions up. If you see things that you really want to see answered, you can use Slido to indicate that you want to see us ask that question live. One of the other things that we're going to do today, I'll be airing a conversation that I had recently with Alex Wicks, who's the head of partnerships for Real Madrid, the football club. We're really looking forward to that because we are actually in a partnership with Real Madrid ourselves. So the Center for Management of Enterprise and Media, Entertainment, and Sports, the Center for Memes here at UCLA Anderson, is actually partnering with Real Madrid University on an initiative for us to create educational experiences for executives to try to make you a little bit smarter, but also to shift your thinking in terms of how you think about the business of sports and entertainment, the kind of journey you're on in terms of reaching fans and audiences, and how we build global brands. We had originally planned to launch in-person experiences last year, slight disruption, but pretty soon I think we'll be able to announce some digital programs that we'll be doing until such time as we'll be able to get back to in-person programming. So the conversation that we'll be airing today will give you a taste, I think, of some of the expertise that we'll be able to share in those sessions. But more importantly, it just reflects a great relationship that we have with the club and with the school. And so I hope you can join us for that. As I mentioned, this evening for us, I'll be sitting down with Emma Ryan Yamazaki, the documentary filmmaker who did Koshien. Koshien is this incredible, incredible film where you get to see the um, really the behind the scenes look at high school baseball in Japan, and it's centered around a very unique experience, the equivalent of March Madness. It's an open, single game elimination knockout tournament that most high schools in Japan participate in. And so, if you can imagine a bunch of young people working really hard to make the team, then to make the starting team, then to compete, and obviously there's only one winner at the end every year. This story kind of tracks a couple of teams, a number of players, and two coaches, and it's just this brilliant look at Japanese culture, at baseball culture, and I think it really helps folks understand some of the similarities and differences with our own. So I really enjoyed that film. I'm looking forward to sitting down with Emma herself to talk about some of the choices she made, how she put it together, but also how she framed the story to make it so accessible. For those of you who ultimately go ahead and see it, you'll find that it's mostly Japanese with subtitles. And after about 2 minutes, you won't even notice, because you kind of feel what the people in the documentary are feeling, and you see for yourself how things work, what people's hopes and dreams are. It's just brilliant. So I encourage you to stick around after the networking session later today to make sure that you catch Emma and me sitting down for a conversation. I want to give one more plug. As I mentioned before, in addition to the networking that you all will have, we're going to do a speed mentoring session on Friday for students. We have, I think, over 50 students signed up, and we're looking for a few more mentors. So for those of you who want to dispense wisdom in 6-minute increments, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us at memes@anderson.ucla.edu. And once again, that's memes@anderson.ucla.edu. And I also want to remind you that we love social media here. I saw a few of you tweeting yesterday. Please feel free to share what you hear, share the wisdom that comes out of these sessions, and hopefully engage a larger audience so that when we do this again in person at some future point, this is not a well-kept secret, but instead is something that everybody's anticipating. Again, the hashtag for the event is UCLA Pulse. Just hashtag UCLA Pulse. I'm at Data Shogun, and our team is at Center for Memes. Feel free to tweet, post, take screen caps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We love to see it. We love to hear it. And finally, I just wanted to call out one of the sessions today because we're going to, as I said, one of the sessions is going to be here in LA. It's the future of sports in LA, and I'm super excited about that. One of our corporate working group members, Terry Hines, who handles communications for Fox Sports, has helped us put together an incredible conversation. And two of the things that come out to me about the future of sports, and you'll see that throughout the day, is one, that it's global, and two, that the future is female. And you'll see that with her panel as well. But I think it's going to be really great to talk about what's happening locally here in Southern California, because we have some incredible events, major events on the horizon. And we've actually had some success over the last year in terms of dealing with the pandemic. And I think some of the folks on that conversation will be able to tell you more about what they've learned, and where we think things are headed. So I welcome you to get involved, get plugged in. Like I said, don't forget the expo, don't forget the networking, don't forget social media, don't forget the session that we're going to be doing in the evening. But we're really looking forward to having you here. Love to engage with you, and hopefully, just like yesterday, today will be a home run. With that, I would like to introduce the next session. As I said, we have an incredible alum, David Dellea, who handles the sports practice for PwC. David does an annual sports survey, a sports business survey. And what's really special about that is that he's able to reach hundreds of decision makers and business leaders in the sports space across Europe to give him a perspective on what's happening and what's coming. This year, we were able to do something really special. And UCLA Anderson partnered with PwC to do a North American version of the survey so that we would be able to incorporate those results into the findings, the insights, but also so that we'd have a better sense of what our business leaders here are thinking about the future of sports. I'm sure that many of you can imagine some of the sentiment that's come out, on the heels of the pandemic with the shift to streaming, people, having to deal with quarantine and being at home and so on. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of upside, both with respect to media rights and television, and with respect to innovations that are happening in the stadium, brand partnerships, and more. David has been kind of tracking those things for years, and so he's developed a number of really important relationships. Among them with some of the international regulatory bodies for professional sports and for amateur sports, and also with a number of the sports clubs, the larger clubs, leagues, etc. David is a wealth of knowledge, and so I'm really thrilled to have him moderate a conversation on this topic. And he was able to help use his relationships to bring some really, really brilliant people along with him. So with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and kick it over to David to introduce the session. David, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here, and go Bruins.
Thank you very much. Indeed, my name is David. I lead the sports practice for PwC. And again, thank you, Jay, most importantly for the collaboration we've had this year on the 2020 PwC Sports Survey, which I hope also to be able to replicate along with you for the 2021 version. As mentioned, I'm an alumni from Anderson, class of 2002. So I'm kind of looking at next year's for the 20 years reunion. So time is really flying. So I'm really glad to be able to introduce you here a bit of a different perspective eventually. And that was kind of the initial ideas as I was speaking up the conversation with Jay, and bring a perspective really of really global international sports. So outside of the remit of the States and of the big leagues that you guys have the privilege of having in North America. And as you'll see, then all of the three panelists are all based in Switzerland, as a matter of fact. And they're not here for the lovely mountain and its attractive tax scheme, but because a lot of the governing bodies indeed are based in Switzerland alongside the IOC. And here the three panelists that I'd like to introduce are from these three organizations. So we have FIFA, the world governing body for soccer or football, right, as we call it here this side of the ocean. We have also FIBA, the world governing body of basketball, and we have ECA with Charlie and the sort of the umbrella, I would say, organization of European soccer clubs across the board. So let me start with the first question, and then I will pass you through you, and then I'd be really glad if you can just introduce yourself quickly and explain your role within the organization. That'd be great. First question, obviously, that we're all facing is COVID-19, the impact of the pandemic. And the interesting point about this is that obviously it has shaken not only the financials fundamentals of many organizations, but also their psyche, I would say. As a matter of fact, it has been pretty much, I would say, one of the first externally generated crises that has affected sports. Most of the other crises tendentially have been rather internal. So that's why what it made it really, I would say, different, right? And has really shaken it from the ground. And I'd like to start with you, Sarai, if that is okay, and just get your perspective on what COVID-19 has impacted in terms of the athletes, but then a lot of the stakeholder around you. And maybe if you can introduce yourself first, that'd be fantastic, Sarai.
Sure. Thank you very much. So my name is Sarai Bareman. I am the Chief Officer in charge of women's football in FIFA, the world governing body for football, as we call it here in Europe. I'm a member of the FIFA Management Board. I'm a former international player myself, and I started my career many, many years ago in the banking and finance industry. So I've been in football now for around 12 years. And the last 3-4 years of my career have been specifically focused on the women's game. And it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. So I think from a FIFA perspective, in terms of the impacts of COVID-19, I guess the most important thing is to acknowledge that first and foremost, above football and above everything else throughout this entire pandemic and this crisis has been the health and well-being of everybody. And I think when I look widely across the entire sports industry, not just football, The approach has been health first. It still is health first, and I believe that that is absolutely 100% the right approach. Obviously, COVID-19 has impacted everybody, not just the sports world. But in terms of football, you know, it's from a FIFA perspective, you know, we govern international football. And obviously, with the border closures and you know, the different issues with international travel, it's had a huge impact on the international game. And that is obviously created a huge impact for FIFA in terms of the competitions that we've been able to deliver. Women's football more specifically, which is really my bread and butter, I think there are probably two key takeaways here that we've kind of observed so far. One being, because of the relative commercial infancy of women's football, we haven't seen the same levels of, I would say, devastating financial impacts that we've seen on the men's side at international, regional, or national level. But on the flip side to that, a lot of the key decisions that have been made throughout this time have been economically driven, which means that women's football has often been, shall we say, second fiddle to the men's game in that respect, because the men's game, as many of you may know, is the #1 commercial earner. That's where the revenue comes from. So in a time like this, you know, decisions are very driven by that. And that means that we've seen right around the world, Europe and America, everywhere, that often the men's leagues and the competitions are given a higher level of focus in terms of returning to play than the women's game have been given. Nevertheless, it's been very, very important for us at FIFA, particularly off the back of the FIFA Women's World Cup in France, which was in 2019, the massive momentum that we got from that tournament and the milestones that it created for women's football. It's really important that as a governing body, we clearly send a signal that we must continue to invest in the women's game. It must remain a priority. And the relief fund that we put in place to provide all our member countries around the world is very reflective of that, with specific funding to support and help the women's football community to overcome the negative impacts. But certainly football has not escaped the impacts, and it's going to be really, really interesting to see over the next couple of years from an international perspective how the global competitions that we're used to seeing, the World Cups, you know, the regional competitions, how they evolve and how they will look.
Thank you very much, Sarai. Maybe just actually just throwing the ball at Charlie, right, as we're talking about football, right? And what is this perspective on your end from a club perspective? There were really obviously many of the players have been suffering significantly. And just quick intros on yourself before you start.
Sure. Thanks, David. Balls, by the way, you don't do that so often in football over here. Just maybe a couple of times, but I think that's your football over there. Maybe Frank is better at the throwing ball comes to basketball. But look, jokes aside, it's really good to be on the panel. My name's Charlie Marshall. I'm the CEO here at the European Club Association, which, as David mentioned, is kind of the umbrella body for the leading clubs in Europe across all of the different European countries. We talk about 55 different European associations that come together and, for example, play international club competitions. You've probably heard of competitions like the Champions League, maybe the Europa League. These are kind of cross-continental club competitions. And the governing body here is UEFA. When it comes to Europe, of course, Sarai represents FIFA with the governing body. And as ECA, we work very, very closely with UEFA in terms of the kind of European club perspective. Quickly on me, I started my career in football. I started out with the Premier League, the English Football League, the sort of top division of English football in sort of strategic commercial roles. I then did a sort of decade-long tour through some technology businesses, through some finance businesses. Spent a fair amount of time in consulting, never with PwC, but certainly with some competitors of PwC. back up here in football, which really feels like my homeland. So look, in terms of COVID, I think there are, Sarai's mentioned some, some of the key stuff actually, and fully support what she said about, about football's priority during COVID, which was first to recognise that this is primarily a public health crisis, first and foremost, and then quickly to recognise that sport does have quite an important role through times of public health, both in terms of being very visible and leading by example, but also in terms of being a kind of gel for society during very difficult times. And it's been trying to balance that's one of the challenges that football's faced, to kind of try and keep the sport going, not just for purely selfish economic sustainability reasons, but also for social reasons in some shape or form, but also to do so in a responsible way. And I think my first takeaway from COVID is the stakeholders involved in this sport, which in the European region, there are many. And indeed, football has a very different stakeholder setup than some of the than the leagues out in the US, and maybe we'll come to talk about that in a bit. But one of the things that had to happen very quickly was a number of stakeholders had to come together, kind of leave self-interest aside, and quickly start to replan this industry so that we could get it back up and running through COVID and try and keep it running. Very rapid replanning of calendars, for example, domestic calendars, regional calendars, international calendars. The balance of the club game versus the international game, which is a very big feature of football globally, not necessarily the case in some of the big US sports. And then working on things like protocols, all of which have different national implications and sort of sit within different jurisdictions, but somehow we had to come together and say, what is the sensible way of running medical and travel and operational protocols? So we really had a sort of revelation, I think, in terms of how stakeholders that can often be quite opposed, when push comes to shove, can really collaborate very effectively. And that was the story of last year. Underneath all of that, of course, or maybe in parallel, was a very, very real and very, very apparent economic crisis that hit all sport, of course. In football's environment, a large proportion of the revenue taps that the sport had come to be accustomed to were turned out with the complete absence of fans attending matches, and because of the economic the industry that has built up over, I would say, 20 or 30 years, namely that kind of costs and revenue are very, very close together. There's very little sort of, if you like, inbuilt sustainability to the economic model out here, because all of the sporting risk is the kind of number one priority for the clubs, and they will spend as much as they possibly can because of that sporting risk, cause serious problems, and those problems are short, medium, and long term. It's becoming very, very clear now, a year into the pandemic, quite how long term those problems are. There's also been a realization, and I'll probably be the first to use this slight cliche on the call, that a lot of the problems that COVID has highlighted were already there in the first place. They were kind of known, but because we were in a period of quite intense growth and long-term growth, in top-tier football, we were double-digit growth for 20 years. And so some of those systemic problems weren't necessarily raised to the surface, but COVID has absolutely done that. So we need to look at how the sport's regulated financially, how players and player costs are treated by the sport, and ultimately how we think about fans on a more long-term basis. I think I'll just end with one point, because this for me actually is the one that is most concerning and the one which I feel is getting the least focus, and that's COVID's impact on the game itself, on football itself. We've been so desperate to keep the whole thing going for all the right reasons, lost a bit of focus on what the product is actually there to do for the fans. What football for the fans, and also what it's there to do long term. I hate to say it, but watching regular games without fans, with clubs just trying to finish the leagues, is not really what we want our game to be. We want the compelling narratives in the game. We want the stars, we want the fans. We want this thing to go. We want it to engage the new generation of fans, and that is something that is kind of concerning. I do also think that the opportunity for new forms of the game, and it's always an honour to be on a pleasure with Sarai. But I really, really hope and feel very positively that whilst the women's game is also experiencing the kind of problems I've outlined, there is a real opportunity here to come through this with a brand new form of football at a sort of global level, and to really sort of put some fire behind that. So just some thoughts from me. I'll hand back to you, David.
Thanks a lot, Charlie. That's super interesting. I have already a follow-up question for you afterwards, but first, let's go to Frank. So same question to you, and quick introduction about yourself.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, Jay, for having me on this prestigious panel. It's actually quite emotional for me when I started thinking and looking in my calendar and realized that today, actually a year ago, I was in LA. I was at this point in time, actually at this hour, at Staples Center for the memorial of Kobe Bryant. It is exactly 1 year ago that we honored not only a legend of the game and an incredible person, but also somebody we worked with. I had the honor to spend time with, I have to say, during our China World Cup. He was our global ambassador, an amazing person, and I still get goosebumps when I speak about it. And that year 2020 started terribly in that sense. Also we lost David Stern, for instance, from the NBA, and Mr. Stankovic, a long-term FIBA general secretary. And it didn't get better after that. It was actually the last big trip I did for a year. And since then, we've been in lockdown, largely in the mountains. And to make the link to myself and FIBA, just to explain that, I am a Dutch person. I'm not a former athlete. I'm a sports marketing person, a business person. I worked a lot also in the world of football and Champions League. And since 2010, more or less, I've taken over the business side of FIBA. Now, when I deal with a largely American audience, I know I always have to explain that FIBA is the governing body of the sport of basketball. The members are 205 national federations. In the United States, that is USA Basketball, not the NBA. The NBA is, of course, an enormous part of the world of basketball and an engine for our sport. And there's no competition. On the contrary, I will come to that later. But actually, the deputy commissioner of the NBA, Mark Tatum, is a member of our executive committee, which is the highest organ. And we work hand in hand across the globe, I would say, to grow the game and to work together. I will be short on COVID. I think most of the things and right things have been said by Sarai and Charlie. It started in actually before a year ago. We had some Olympic qualifying tournaments also in China, which we had to relocate. At that point, we thought it was going to be maybe more regional or temporary thing. This, of course, has become a global issue, still is as we speak. We have all had to react and to improvise. And on a higher level, that has been the international calendar and the move of the Olympic Games from 2020 to 2021, of course, had an enormous knock-on effect on all the other competitions. But so far, we have been able to manage that. Our national federations and national leagues have been suffering big time. If you play indoors in this environment, if you rely for many reasons on fans, if you If your income structure is largely built around that and playing games and live games, it's obvious that there has been an impact, and I would concur what has been said. Of course, health and safety goes first. At the same time, I also agree with Charlie. It's a good moment to look at the fundamentals of the sport and how things are built and constructed, and how dependent sport has become on certain things happening. And I think all of us realize in some shape or form that our contingency planning and our reserves planning could have been better. And I also believe that there's many things that can change now, and crisis as an opportunity sounds a bit cheesy maybe, but it is true. There is an opportunity now to build certain things up better than they were before.
Thanks, Frank. Maybe just a follow-up questions indeed. So looking at COVID-19 only as a negative, I think it'd be too short-sighted. I think obviously COVID-19 per se has been transformational. As you were pointing out, Charlie, it has set clarity on some of the shortcomings that some organization had, but it also has enhanced a kind of the push towards prioritizing, being more strategic and being more transformational, right, about a lot of the agenda that sports organization are following. And one topic that I know, because I discussed it many times with you, is the ability to be able to share better resources, right? So, and obviously here we're talking to a North American audience where kind of a lot of the leagues obviously have their business based on shared resources. Yeah. So any thoughts that you'd like to share on how you see the appetite for European football, European soccer, actually, to also take some more of this approach on around shared services and shared resources?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a very early stage student, but a big admirer of the model that the NBA has, which is just probably the one I have looked at most in the TMBO business, in the team marketing and business operations business, which is that sort of, if you like, internal, I'm going to call it a crack unit, because that's how I like to think of it. But something that's built into the structure of that league, and that is quite sort of free and well empowered to move between the clubs, doing quite strategic work on a sort of, shared, let's call it insight, shared services basis, and really helping to kind of fuel the, fuel both the individual clubs and their collectivization as a league, but doing very sort of work. I wouldn't even deign to compare what we do in football to that, but it is something that we try to look towards, because I personally, and people out here, do believe that there is a model whereby, without significantly affecting the competitive advantage of the different clubs, there is much more sharing that can be done. What do we mean by sharing? I think there are a couple of, maybe 2 or 3 key things. The thing that we focused on most is the sharing of voice, is the sharing of representation. And again, it's a little bit because of the way that football is structured out here between the clubs, the national leagues, the national federations, and the international federations. Everybody sort of controls a different element of the industry. So something like, if we talk P&L, for a football club, by far and away the biggest element of their economics, the cost of players, is salary costs. And therefore, what can be done in terms of levers to affect things like the transfer system and how players are sort of are treated and regulated in the context of clubs is a huge economic lever. So when clubs think about sharing resources and sharing things, they like to come together and lobby in collective interests. That's what we focused on a lot in the past. Again, it's because of the way that the system is structured. I could talk about things like competition design, the agreements on calendar. There are many, many things where collective representation is probably the most effective way of sharing. But I think looking forwards, I also like to think we can get a little bit more, let me say, business smart over here when it comes to sort of collective sharing of resource. There is more work to be done on the cost side, and I think this is what you and I have talked most about, David. It's clear that something does need to be done about the insustainability of revenues and player costs. Once that is achieved, there can then be more focus, I think, on the rest of the cost base of club football. Whilst at the moment it represents a reasonably small proportion of revenues, I think in the future it will actually start to grow, and therefore more focus will be put on it. And I think we can get to things like, at the very basic level, kind of core business process sharing, and then slightly higher up maybe the strategic stack. Everybody out here needs to do a much better job of managing their data, managing their fan data, coming together and sort of managing the fundamentals of fan engagement strategies going forwards. There's a lot more move to, direct to consumer and over the top. And there is absolutely no point clubs, who even the bigger ones, some of our members in the likes of Real Madrid, which was mentioned, and Juventus and Bayern Munich, they're still reasonably small businesses. You don't really have a club, especially now in COVID, you don't have a club that turns over $1 billion in revenue. Okay, it's not a small business, but you don't have any mega businesses over here in clubs. And so, all of them building their own platforms and their own infrastructure, it doesn't make any sense economically. There has to be some sharing that's been seen in other industries, which comes into football. So I'm sure of that. And then maybe back to the team marketing example at the start. I also think that clubs can be a little bit more open to say, look, we're competitors on the pitch and that will never change. But off the pitch, we can be less competitive and we can be a little bit more open to kind of sharing some of the success stories, sharing some of the more strategic stuff that we work on, and hopefully for the benefit of all. I do also think, maybe another effect of COVID, football is waking up to a reality that says, we're not the only game in town, not even just in a sports sense, particularly when we come to look at the younger generation. We're part of, and actually sport has a problem. Sport has a problem for the younger generation. Participation, it concerns me. The amount of choice that's available for the younger generation not to get hooked on the narrative of sports like probably we all did, that kind of concerns me. So I think that's going to bring a different kind of perspective, more collaboration, and that's definitely what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah. One form of collaboration, obviously, is that of working intensively or more, actually, and I'm thinking here governing bodies specifically. So working more closely with potential investors. So doing partnership and understanding and kind of acknowledging the fact that eventually the commercial exploitation of a property or of a product per se may be better handled hand in hand with a non-political organization that has the right expertise and right insights to bring this across. And of course, Frank, the question is to you. So you've been having a relatively good model of collaboration with certain agencies, which are much more advanced than the old model, so to speak, right? Of just wholesaling rights, so to speak. But at the same time, we see a lot of private equity investors coming in, and Charlie, you know that better also than anyone else, with a big influx actually in football. So any thoughts or your viewpoint on how COVID-19 has also accelerated the push towards collaboration, and how do you see this space going forward, Frank?
Yeah, sure. The interesting thing is I heard from somebody who works a lot with funds and with these ideas. And he told me, he said, listen, I've been working with these ideas for the last 3 to 5 years, and nobody would, return my phone calls. And now they're chasing me. And I think that is showing that the tide has turned. And personally, I can see a lot of scenarios where it will be beneficial for sports organizations, also clubs or leagues in the sport, to embrace that. I would be very careful, but by doing that without clearly knowing what you're letting yourself into. I mean, personally, I'm not so much in favor of a pure financial partner. If it is a strategic partner that can bring resources which are more than a check alone, and that is there for the longer run, I think there are good options out there. I also think that there's many partnership models, and we operate some that do not require necessarily seeding equity, because sometimes people forget that you enter into a partnership, but many partners at some point want to exit. And how does that go? Who do you end up with as your equity partner in your house, et cetera, et cetera. And so you must think through the pros and cons. I would be careful just taking the check for taking the check. I mean, you really need to go through all the elements. But I mean, I throw a little bit more controversial in here, maybe also for the world of football. I think there is also some elements where bringing in an equity business partner can actually be the real catalyst for them to make some change to political procedures which are not professional. And bringing a partner, even with a minority stake, may force them to take a step back on the business, focus more on the sport and the politics, and leave the business to professionals rather than to ambitious people with big egos.
So moving on now, Sarai, the next question is for you. So FIFA has pledged $1 billion for the women's game actually over a 4-year cycle. And again, going back again to COVID-19, obviously a lot of football clubs, specifically now if you look internationally, have acknowledged the fact that they had a high degree of dependency from a product perspective, from a commercial partner perspective. And here the women's game actually bring an amazing answer, because suddenly you have a new storytelling that actually is right there, that you can start exploiting, and that's why we've seen, I think, one of the key driver why a lot of talent has been moving actually from North America to Europe as well from that perspective. So can you outline a little bit how you see kind of this development and the opportunity of the women's game from a club football perspective?
I think it is the biggest growth opportunity that we have to football today, to be honest. If you look at the domestic clubs and leagues and the landscape that exists now in the women's game, and if you compare that to where the men's game is, it's very, very clear where the opportunities lie in terms of growth. And I'm talking about growth in terms of commercial, financially, just the structures that surround the women's game. Things as basic as, conditions surrounding players, to the way that the game is marketed, the communication around it, everything. The women's game at a club and elite level is really still at a very young and developing stage. And you only have to look at, figures related to the international transfer market, comparing the men's to the women, to really understand how vast that gap is. And I see that as a really positive thing, because what it highlights is, the huge growth opportunity that lies there. And I think, as a governing body, clubs, leagues, associations at every level, there's not one kind of magic bullet that is going to accelerate that growth. We really collectively have to address the entire ecosystem of the women's game. It's not, just one element. We've got to look at things like the competitions, the formats, the commercial side of things, the grassroots, the very developing parts of the game, the infrastructure surrounding it. And one of the things that we're looking at quite keenly is, as the women's game starts to professionalize, what can we do as FIFA with the regulatory framework that we have to support that growth, but also to avoid some of the pitfalls that we have seen on the men's side. And I'm sure everyone on this panel will agree that, some of the numbers that we're seeing in terms of, transfer fees and salaries and things on the men's side of the game, it's just not sustainable, as Charlie mentioned. And we're in a unique position now as our game grows to actually direct it to avoid some of those pitfalls. And I think this is something that the stakeholders need to collectively understand, and perhaps, some of that unity that we've seen through COVID-19, we really need to see that continue to ensure that the women's game can grow and reach the full potential that we know that it can.
Thank you very much. Next question for you, Charlie. I was obviously there is a huge debate, obviously, between going on here in Europe between having kind of an open system like traditional club football has been historically, and increasing talks about a potential super league or more of a closed kind of system. And we've seen the discussions over the last couple of weeks by UEFA on the changes to the Champions League, with certain new indexes and new kind of factors that are brought in that try to kind of cut the apple in half, if I may say so to speak. Any thoughts on your end in terms of what are the key drivers behind this push towards more closed system versus that of keeping an open system?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, definitely before coming on to any talk of changes to the Champions League, we've got to highlight the change to the Champions League, which actually is coming in 2021, which is the Revamp Women's Champions League. Just to kind of follow on from where Sarai left off, I mean, I will come on to your question, David, but one of the things that is really hugely exciting us right now is a very big change to the women's elite European competition run by UEFA out here, which ECA has been fundamentally involved in, and Sarai as well. Probably for the first time, that's really now starting to look like a proper elite, dare I say it, commercializable competition, and something that can start to prove where that huge growth inevitably is from a kind of product side. Because I just wanted to land that one because it's a favorite topic. In terms of the sort of open close debate and let's say the spectre of the Super League, which is there are lots of Super Leagues, by the way, including women's Super Leagues, but the Super League that you're referring to is this notion that some of the kind of big brand clubs in Europe that are now very, very well known globally, as we've gone through that sort of, or as we're going through the globalization of football, have kind of they've sort of grown out of the system somehow, or they're sort of bursting out of the system, which is European football, which is this kind of pyramid from top to bottom of European football, and that the sort of inevitability somehow is that they have to kind of break away, form their own competition, and a much sort of smaller competition, much more similar to the competitions you see at the very, very top level of North American sport. And there are debates which come up in largely the media from time to time, and we've been living through one for the last sort of 6 months or so as to whether this will or won't happen, and who is or isn't involved, and whether it's legal or whether it's not. I think at the core of it is a really very important debate and a reflection about the kind of very nature of the European system of sport itself, particularly the system of football, which since it was created has fundamentally been an open system. What do we mean by an open system? It's probably best described as any sort of team in the professional game, and the professional game goes from right at the very top to very, very low down. There can be sort of 20 leagues in some countries between top and bottom. Any team theoretically has the ability to move through that system and ultimately get to the very, very top. And so promotion and relegation is the sort of key tool that is used to get promoted or relegated between the tiers of the system. And this kind of hung together, and it still hangs together, but it hung together in a world before you started to feel the polarization that inevitably comes with market forces. As the world isn't big enough for the thousands of football brands that exist, the thousands of professional football clubs that exist in Europe, and so inevitably there is a kind of gravitation to the top. There's a polarization. It's to do with players, to do with stars, to do with geography, to do with sporting success, to do with a lot. And so the debate that the Super League causes is, can this system actually hold together in the long term, or is it just going to break apart because market forces are just not? It means that it's not sustainable. Inevitably, even in the system we have right now, the value comes in at the top and is sort of flown down. There's a huge subsidy model that exists to make the system what it is. I think the other debate, a little bit with a US North American lens on, is do we have the right product? We do have some amazing products in terms of leagues and competitions, both at domestic level and international product level, like the La Liga in Spain, the Premier League in England. But there's always that debate about, is there something better? I think what it sort of ultimately comes down to, and you referenced it a little bit earlier on, and Frank also, I think, in his sort of provocative statement, it's really that we're kind of at a crossroads at the moment, frankly. We are at a crossroads between the game, the financing of the game, the economics of the game, and the governance of the game. And it's going to go one of two ways, I think, for the next decade. From an ECA perspective, we're very much part of the movement that seeks to reform the system from within. And so we fundamentally believe that there is a better continuing to evolve the competitions that we've already got to make this open system work, but probably in a slightly different, probably recognizing that inevitably there are different tiers, and honest about that, and saying, whilst it's theoretically possible for a club to go from the bottom to the top, it's highly, highly unlikely that that will ever happen. And without closing the doors, can we at least bring new formats, new economic models, new commercial models that might sort of satisfy those at the top, develop those in the middle, and maybe kind of really increase participation of those at the bottom. And we definitely think that that's possible. If you just take the European club competitions, another interesting thing happening in 2021 in August is a third men's competition will be launched, which will be called the Europa Conference League. And so you'll have the Champions League, you'll have the Europa League, which is the sort of second tier, and then you'll have a third tier. And we really see that as the ability to kind of say, look, this is all the sort of fantastic, glitzy glamour football up here. It's really the top of the top. This second tier is, it's no longer just the sort of developing clubs, but it's the seriously ambitious, seriously professional clubs that actually definitely have a chance to make the top, but it gives them a proper competition to actually compete within. And then at the third tier, we've got that nod to, there are clubs who are really just getting into the international scene for the first time. They're really just starting out on their journey. It's probably going to take quite a while for them to go to the top, if ever. But there is a real kind of reason for them to be where they are, and a really kind of compelling thing for fans of those clubs to get behind. So I think we're already trying to restructure the system in Europe to recognise that the fully open system has its limits, but we do ultimately hang together.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much, Charlie. Frank, last question for you. So one of the key roles of FIBA as an international federation is that of bringing the sport across all corners of the world, clearly. And 2019 has been a big year because you guys have had the World Cup in China, a country where basketball is already the dominant sport. So what are your insights in terms of how the sport has been globalizing, specifically in such a growth market like China, given also the fact that the NBA, for example, has been present there since 1992, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, no, I mean, as you say, we have a global role, and basketball is a global sport. On the men's side, on the women's side, on the basketball discipline, and also, by the way, on the discipline which is called 3x3, which is the let's say street basketball version, which will be a full medal discipline in Tokyo if things go ahead, which we're very excited about. And it will also open up the opportunities for many countries to play for Olympic medals. The globalization is important, and I must say, of course, we are, as I said, hand in hand with the NBA, because NBA is of course a commercial league. They want to develop their business. That is fine, and the more basketball prospers around the world, the better that is for us and for the NBA. I would say basketball is very blessed to have the NBA and players, partners, strategic partners like Nike that we have, because basketball is not only global, but is also having global icons that help to promote the sport. And football has the same, of course, but some of our other Olympic peers have less benefit from that. So China was, a game-changing World Cup for us. We changed the calendar. We moved the World Cup in a free year, not competing with the Football World Cup. And in 8 amazing cities in China. The smallest of the 8 was a city called Foshan with 7.5 million inhabitants. So, this is a skill that you cannot imagine. And we really worked there 3 years in terms of that event. So the idea was that the World Cup itself was, a focal point for the road to and the legacy after. And as a matter of fact, we still have an office in Beijing today to deal with the legacy of the World Cup. So that's one example. But another example is a joint venture that FIBA has started with the NBA in Africa. The BAL, the Basketball African League, is a JV between the NBA and FIBA to grow the club game in Africa. And so, we go everywhere around the globe, and we have, of course, the benefit of having a global game, but of course, you have different strengths in countries. So some of you may not know that, for instance, in the Philippines, basketball is the number one sport. It's like a religion. It's bigger than football. There is not so many countries in the world, but there are a few that is the case. But for instance, to take an example closer to home for us, the Netherlands or UK is a different ball game where we need to promote more, to get also boys and girls to bounce a ball and to start playing and getting touch. And we see more and more initiatives, as I said, through 3xP, but also interestingly through the esports space, because we saw a lot of kids going from basketball to NBA 2K game, but now some of them come the other way around.
Sorry, I was on mute. There you go. So I was saying we're up with the time, I guess. So I wanted to give the floor back to Jay, but I don't know if there are any questions that we can take before we close off. Okay. Yeah. So what? Exactly. Very good. So, question for you, Sarai, so what will it take actually to grow the women's football to a level where really it can be matched or can be actually closer to the men's game? So what are kind of the levers that need to be set in place?
I think competition is a massive one. Those are the biggest drivers of development for us, and also popularity. So one of the things, for example, that we're working on now is a Club World Cup for women. There doesn't exist a club competition for women. The winner of the newly revamped Women's Champions League in Europe, they're going to want to match themselves against the champions from other continents. So I think competitions are a huge, huge driver for us. And we saw that from the Women's World Cup in France. 1.12 billion people from around the world tuned in to watch that tournament. So clearly there is a massive interest there. And it's just about bringing that consistency in terms of competitions for women. So more Champions Leagues. We need to see that happening not only in Europe, but in the other continents and confederations as well. I think we need to look also at the domestic leagues. Between the 4 years of the World Cup, we need to keep the eyes of the world on football, the women's game, and our athletes. And the domestic leagues and the national competitions, that's what we need to push and drive and really professionalize those as well. So there's lots of levers that we can pull, and I mentioned it before. I don't think there's one magic pill. we really have to look at addressing the entire ecosystem of the game to close the gap and really bring it to the level where we know it can reach. So it's an exciting time for sure. And one thing I would just quickly like to add, we don't have to copy and paste what has happened in men's football. I think there are some lessons that we can learn that are amazing, but I think that we have to be outside of the box in the way that we look at the women's game and the way we grow it. And for me, that's a really exciting prospect, not only for those of us that are in the women's game, but for football more widely. And dare I say it, you know, the stakes are not as high at the moment in the women's game. So maybe some of these things that are being called for on the men's side can actually be rolled out in women's football before the men's game can take them on board.
Okay, so I think we'll be moving on then. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending this panel conversation, taking the time to have a look basically beyond kind of the remit of North America and look a bit what's going on in the rest of the world with a focus on Europe. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the panelists that have taken the time on short notice to be attending this panel conversation this evening. So thanks, Charlie, thanks, Sarai, and thanks, Frank, for taking part. So floor is back to you, Jay.
David, thank you so much, panelists. That was an amazing conversation. We appreciate you. Good evening and good night.